She could have killed him on sight, but instead, she touched his hand and the war stopped. In a frozen corner of the solar system, where sunlight barely kisses the ice of Europa, an ancient war was reignited not by guns, but by memory. He was just a human soldier, ordinary, expendable. She was a queen of a forgotten alien empire, sculpted from bone and fury, bred for vengeance. And yet, when their paths collided aboard a dying starship, something impossible happened. Secrets buried beneath Earth's history awakened. The Korea Sentient Archive, older than civilization, recognized him, called to him, and through him revealed everything we were never meant to know. The betrayal, the ancient alliance, the truth Earth's leaders burned from history. But this isn't a story of war. This is the moment when war stopped. As soldiers closed in and her kind lay dying, she pressed her wounded hand into his and offered him a choice: godlike power or peace. And in that single heartbeat between blade and breath, he chose neither. He chose hope. And now the galaxy waits to see if humanity remembers how to be brave. Under the pale shimmer of Europa's distant sun, the storm raged like a thing alive, screaming across the ice with a voice that sounded far too human. The landscape stretched in frozen silence, cracked and fractured like a broken mirror, and somewhere amid the howling wind and electric haze, Corporal Darren Ryle moved slow, stiff, and breath fogging inside his cracked helmet. His boots crunched over jagged frost. Each step sent a faint tremor up his spine. His scanner, once a loyal companion, now spat static and flickered uselessly in his gloved hand. The storm had teeth, and it had sunk them deep into the sky, cutting off every form of communication he had left. No contact, no direction. Just the humming of Europa's atmosphere and a sinking sense that he was not supposed to be here. Then he saw it, a subtle glow beneath the ice-like, a breath held just below the surface. Not a reflection, not a malfunction, something alive. The glow pulsed faintly, a slow, rhythmic throb like a heartbeat struggling against suffocation. Darren paused. His instincts told him to turn back, but something older, deeper urged him forward. He knelt beside the glow and brushed away snow and grit until the ice beneath him cracked with a sound like snapping bone. The ground gave way. He fell, down into cold shadow and light. The descent felt endless, as if the planet had swallowed him whole. Then impact. His shoulder hit something soft and warm, which made no sense at all. Europa was not warm. And this place pulsed with an alien breath. He pushed himself up, flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam of light danced across walls not made of metal but of something else, something organic, curved, translucent, pulsating gently with hues of violet and cyan. The structure itself seemed to inhale with him. Then a sound, subtle at first, wet, clicking, deliberate. Darren raised the light and saw her. She towered in the shadows, limbs folded like a predatory statue, exoskeleton gleaming like obsidian soaked in moonlight. Her eyes, multifaceted and glowing dimly with an internal light, locked onto him. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The space bowed around her, bent to her stillness. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not a sound, but a force vibrating through the chamber, resonating in his bones. "You dare trespass, human?" Darren froze, breath caught somewhere between a scream and prayer. Yet somehow, despite the tremble in his knees and the sweat gathering cold on his neck, sarcasm spilled from his lips before reason could stop him. Hi, love what you've done with the place." A pause. Then movement slow and liquid, like a serpent waking beneath the waves. She descended from her perch, eyes never leaving his, her limbs unfolded with elegance and menace. She circled him, not walking, not crawling, but flowing through the air in deliberate gestures. He noticed the temperature change, warmer. The chamber wasn't reacting to the queen, it was reacting to him. "You smell like the old world," she whispered, not with malice, but with something else. Curiosity, hunger. He dared a step back. The floor pulsed under his foot like a living thing. She noticed. She always noticed. "This place remembers you," she said. "Me? That's unlikely. I just got here." "No," she hissed, mandibles clicking. "You returned." That word lodged itself in his skull like a splinter. Returned? What did she mean? He wasn't part of any ancient mission or lost crew. He was just a corporal, a scout barely ranked above cannon fodder. But the way the walls pulsed, the way the light bent around him, the way she looked at him like he was a puzzle finally falling into place, it all said otherwise. And deep beneath his confusion, something inside him stirred. Something that didn't feel human at all. Outside, the storm screamed louder. But down here, below the ice, beneath the layers of forgotten time, a different storm was waking one, older, quieter, and far more dangerous. Darren had stumbled into something that didn't just want to be found. It had been waiting. She moved like gravity bowed to her, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if each step was carved into the bones of the ship itself. The chamber obeyed her presence. Lights that weren't lights pulsed in unison with her breath, and the walls, slick and alive, whispered in frequencies Darren's ears couldn't catch but his skin could feel. She descended from the throne, not walking but flowing, her joints folding with predatory grace, black armor glistening beneath the strange ambient bioluminescence. Her mandibles clicked in rhythm with something ancient, and her multifaceted gaze drank in Darren's figure with the hunger of a creature who hadn't decided whether he was guest, relic, or prey. Darren didn't move. Couldn't. Not because he was afraid, though, fear coiled around his heart like a vice, but because moving would have acknowledged the moment for what it was. The beginning of something irreversible. Her voice came not from her mouth, but through the room itself, a layered vibration that pressed into his chest. "Your kind once stood here," she said, circling him like a memory stalking the edges of consciousness. "Long ago, before you forgot." The words sank into his spine like frost. He wanted to laugh, he wanted to run, but all he could do was answer. "We humans forget a lot," he said, voice dry, cracked. "Birthdays, galactic treaties, lunch." Her head tilted, slightly, like a blade being drawn. "You mock death?" she said, not as an accusation, but a genuine question, as though his words might reveal something vital, something long sought but never found. He shrugged. It wasn't bravado, it was exhaustion. "Honestly, I think it's mocking me." She stopped, right in front of him now, tall enough that her gaze stared down at the crown of his head. Her breather, the simulation of it, was warm against his face. And still, she didn't strike. Instead, she leaned in, not close enough to touch, but close enough that Darren could feel his own reflection refracted in her crystalline eyes. She was studying him, not as an enemy, but as a contradiction. "There is something fractured within you," she said, like metal melted and reshaped. "I've been through things," he muttered, not sure if it was meant as humor or confession. She inhaled sharply, the walls dimming slightly as if the ship itself reacted to her doubt. "You carry traces," she murmured, "old blood, touched by echoes not your own, and yet you are still incomplete. Lady, you sound like my last therapist." The ship shuddered violently. Somewhere in the distance, metal screamed a roar, not of mechanics but of life and pain. Darren staggered, reached instinctively for the wall, only to find it warm and beating like a pulse beneath his palm. The queen didn't flinch. Her head whipped toward the unseen disturbance, her mandibles tensed, her lower arms twitching with instinct she had not used in centuries. "They are early," she said, to no one in particular. "The scavenger's hunger. The pact is broken." "What pact?" She turned slowly, her expression unreadable but heavy with something Darren couldn't name. "Not all wars begin with armies. Some begin with silence, with choices left unspoken." "Yeah, well," Darren replied, scanning the chamber for exits. "I've never been great at reading the fine print." Another tremor. The chamber lights stuttered. Far below them, a howl of energy climbed like static up a spine. "We are breached," she said. "They seek the core." "Who's they?" Her gaze locked with his again, but this time there was no threat in her eyes-only calculation. "The ones who made you forget." Something deep in Darren's stomach twisted. Not just fear. Recognition. A memory not his own. A face. A word. A scream across galaxies. Before he could speak, her claws slid out not at him, but toward the chamber wall. She traced a jagged line across its surface, revealing a panel that hissed open, spilling a faint violet mist. "You will follow," she said, "or you will die." He hesitated. Everything in him screamed that none of this was in the training manuals. But somewhere past the dread, past the disbelief, Something ancient stirred in his chest, a pulse that did not come from him. And without knowing why, he followed. They came like ghosts laced in fire, slipping through the black like serpents with teeth made of plasma and hatred etched into their hulls. No warning, no formation. Just death, riding in silent waves through Europa's orbit, falling upon the frozen world with all the elegance of ruin. The Kroth Syndicatesque Avengers in name only descended like a plague, drawn by a scent no human could perceive. But Syraxa smelled it the moment the core had stirred. Its awakening was not subtle. To those who hunted such power, it was a beacon. The hull screamed first. A long, low groan that vibrated through the chamber floor like the wail of something ancient realizing it was about to be eaten alive. Darren barely had time to register the shift in light before the far wall bulged, then shattered inward, spraying shards of glowing chitin and alien steel. He flinched, instinctively reaching for a weapon he didn't have, while Syraxa moved, not panicked, not surprised, but with the lethal grace of a queen long betrayed and endlessly prepared. Her claws flared, not in defense, but command. The ship responded like a living beast, channels opening, hatches hissing, and from the shadowed walls poured her warrior stall, sleek and vicious, eyes glowing with collective fury. They didn't scream, they simply moved. Syraxa turned, voice like thunder wrapped in silk. They followed the scent of activation, the core draws predators. Darren ducked beneath a sparking pipe as another impact rocked the corridor, his breath coming sharp. "Can't you just turn it off?" She looked back at him, her gaze not angry, worse, disappointed. "Would you silence your own soul?" The ship shuddered again, a more violent tremor this time, and above them a crack split the ceiling wide, bleeding pale blue mist that clung to Darren's skin like static fog. He didn't need her to explain, he could feel it. The core wasn't a machine, it was something older, something that remembered. They ran. Not away, but deeper. Down corridors that felt more like veins than hallways, pulsing with tension, lit by fibers that blinked like nerves in distress. Syraxa barked a command in a language that made Darren's teeth itch, and a wall dissolved ahead, opening into a narrow passage just as a Kroth drone lunged from behind, its blade arm catching the air where Darren's neck had just been. He fell forward, rolled instinctively, and scrambled to his feet. Behind him, one of Syraxa's guards slammed the Kroth against the wall with a force that cracked bone and armor alike. Blood dark, copper-scented, splattered across the walls, and Darren tasted iron before realizing it wasn't his. "Keep moving," she hissed, not with concern, with certainty, like she already knew how far he could be pushed before he'd breaken, how close they were to finding out. Another breach opened ahead, Kroth skittering in now like rabid insects, their armor grown over in crude cybernetics, red eyes scanning for weakness. One lunged at Darren. He sidestepped barely and brought his elbow up hard, connecting with something soft and vital. The Kroth shrieked, and Syraxa's tail whipped through the air, severing its spine in one smooth strike. "You adapt quickly," she muttered, more observation than praise. He spat blood onto the floor, wincing. "Yeah, well, I learn fast when people are trying to turn me into sushi." She paused for half a breath, mandibles twitching, almost amusement. They reached a junction where the ship opened into a long viewing gallery. Transparent walls revealed the horror outside of dozens of Kroth ships, descending in perfect silence, their engines devouring Europa's thin atmosphere. The moon's surface fractured under their landers. It wasn't just an attack, it was an occupation. Darren stared in stunned silence. "There's too many, we can't hold this." Syraxa's gaze narrowed. "We don't need to hold, we need to unbind." The word wasn't translation. It came raw from her, unfiltered by language or diplomacy. Darren felt it like a pulse in his bones. The core was not a reactor, not merely knowledge. It was alive, and she was going to unleash it. "You're not talking about a defense mechanism, are you?" he said, suddenly unsure whether he was still on the right side of this queen. "No," she said, turning toward the corridor again. "I'm talking about ending the Kroth, and every species who follows them." He grabbed her arm, surprising them both. "That includes mine, doesn't it?" Her expression didn't change, but her silence did. She was weighing him, weighing humanity. Behind them, the Kroth roared. The ship screamed, and somewhere far below the core began to stir like something dreaming of war. There was a silence deeper than space itself inside the sanctum. The walls didn't hum here. They breathed. Smooth, organic surfaces curved inward like the ribcage of some slumbering beast, and above them, faint threads of bioluminescent light wove through the darkness like veins suspended in amber. It didn't feel like a room. It felt like a memory sealed off from war, untouched by time. Darren sat on one knee beside Siraxa, her towering frame still as a statue, her gaze locked on a distant point he couldn't see. She didn't flinch when he reached for her arm, though he felt her body coil just slightly enough to let him know she could gut him in a heartbeat if she changed her mind. The wound was shallow, but it had split along the seam of a joint, where her chitin met exposed tissue. Pale green fluid pulsed gently beneath translucent muscle, and Darren's hands, trembling at first, worked methodically to seal it with a Medigel patch pulled from what was left of his utility pack. The gel hissed as it made contact. Siraxa didn't make a sound. "You should have let one of your soldiers do this," he murmured, eyes fixed on the work. "I'm not exactly trained in xenomedics." "They would not touch me while I bleed," she said, voice low, almost reflective. To be wounded in their presence is to be seen as unmade. Darren looked up. "So why let me?" She met his eyes, and for once, he didn't feel like prey under that stare. "Because you're already broken." He chuckled under his breath. "Well, can't argue with that." For a moment, there was no tension between them, just the pulse of the chamber, the warmth of strange blood, the smell of ozone and dust. She flexed her claw experimentally. The patch held. "You remember pain," she said. "That's rare for your kind." "We don't forget pain," he replied quietly. "We just bury it, deep, pretend it's something else. Pride, maybe, sometimes anger, sometimes orders." She looked at him long and hard, then finally turned her gaze toward the ceiling, where a thin arc of shimmering script curved across the dome etched in something older than writing, alive with dormant energy. "Your world denied our pact," she said. "Burned the evidence, called it myth, but we remembered." Darren wiped his hands on his sleeve, not because they were dirty, but because he needed something to do that wasn't looking at her. "I don't remember any pact," he said. "I don't even remember what normal feels like." She tilted her head. "Do you believe memory only lives in your mind?" He didn't answer. "The core knows your species," she continued. "We shared knowledge with your ancestors. When your skies were still clear, when your people still listened to the stars instead of shouting at them. What happened?" Her mandibles clicked softly. "Your leaders feared what they could not control. They struck before we could complete the binding. Betrayal was not a decision, it was a reflex." "That's not all of us." "No," she agreed, "but it was enough." The quiet returned, heavier now. Darren stared at the floor, tracing a faint spiral in the pattern beneath him. It responded to his touch, glowing faintly. "Some of us," he said, voice tight, "just want the truth." She regarded him for a long time, and something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not trust, but recognition. "You remind me of one of them," she said. "A human who stood here once and bled for something he believed in. I watched him die screaming, but he never recanted." Darren looked up. "Then maybe you owe us a second chance." "I owe your kind nothing." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but maybe you owe yourself hope." She blinked slowly. It was the closest thing to a sigh he'd ever seen her make. Then she stood, her height casting a shadow that fell across his chest like a verdict. "You are soft, human," she said, "but not weak. I'll take that as a compliment." "Don't. It is a warning." He stood with her. "Fair enough, but I've survived worse than compliments." A low vibration passed through the floor, faint, rhythmic like a call being answered in the dark. She turned toward the exit. "The core is listening," she said, "and soon it will decide whether either of us deserve to live." And without waiting for permission, she moved into the corridor, her silhouette swallowed by the glow ahead. Darren followed faster this time, with something colder than curiosity building in his chest. The core had awakened, and judgment was coming. It didn't look like a machine, not in the way humans understood machines. It pulsed, it breathed, and it sang not with sound, but with memory. A great crystalline structure stood before them, rising from the floor like the ribcage of a dead god, its translucent facets glowing from within with veins of living light. It wasn't cold. It radiated something warm and ancient, like the core of a sun left sleeping too long in the dark. The chamber they stepped into didn't have walls, not really. It had presence. The air was dense, not with heat or humidity, but with knowledge layered, waiting, restless. Darren felt it before his boots even touched the threshold. A pull, a tug somewhere deep in his chest, behind his ribs, beneath the skin where dreams usually hid. The core knew him, not his name, not his rank. It knew something older, something buried. Syraxa slowed her pace as they approached, her breathing changeless, rhythmic, more reverent. Her shoulders squared like she was bracing for judgment. Darren walked beside her, but it didn't feel like walking towards something. It felt like being drawn in. The core responded to his presence before he even got close. Tendrils of light extended from its surface, like fingers made of refracted starlight reaching. His skin prickled, the air thickened. And then a whisper not in his ears, but inside his skull. Not words, impressions, grief, flame, betrayal, hope. He staggered. Syraxa steadied him with a clawed hand, but her voice was steady. It recognizes you. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. What? What is it doing? Testing, she said, deciding. A low frequency rolled through the chamber, a heartbeat of stone and light. The core pulsed brighter, brighter still, and Darren could feel something slicing through the layers of who he thought he washes. Memories, his fears, his lies. And then, a sharp tone crackled into the room. Artificial, ugly, wrong. Corporal Ryle, the voice snapped through the static. This is Commander Hadrian Holt, Earth Central Command. You are interacting with a classified foreign system. Disengage immediately and await retrieval. Darren blinked, pulling back, as if the voice had slapped him. How did they? Syraxa's eyes narrowed, her mandibles flaring in frustration. They have been listening longer than you know. The comm crackled again. You are to stand down, Ryle. You are in violation of Galactic protocol and endangering human diplomatic assets. Disengage now, or we will consider you compromised. Darren laughed. Not because it was funny, but because he suddenly understood how deep the rot went. Classified? He said aloud, speaking to the voice in the air. You mean the galactic time bomb I'm standing on? The one tied to Earth's buried history, ancient tech we pretended didn't exist? You don't understand what you're tampering with. No, Darren snapped, stepping closer to the core. But I think I'm finally starting to understand what you did tamper with. The core reacted instantly. Its lights coiled tighter, forming patterns around his body like a cradle woven of language. His boots lifted half an inch off the ground. A hum bloomed in his chest, deep and primal. He must connect, Syraxa said, her voice edged with warning, with hope, or all perish. Don't do it, Ryle, Holt's voice barked. This is your last chance. Back away from that structure. But Darren didn't move. Because in that moment, the core wasn't just light and crystal. It was faces. It was echoes. A kaleidoscope of lives that weren't his but could have been. Memories not written in ink, but in DNA. A bridge that led backward and forward. And it had chosen him. He didn't know what that meant. Only that walking away would mean never finding out who he really was, who they all could have been. So he raised his hand, eyes locked on the core, and let it take him. He didn't fall. He dissolved. There was no sound, no color, just sensation unraveling from the edges, inward like he'd been peeled out of his body, stripped of name, rank, and flesh, until all that remained was raw awareness, suspended in light that breathed like a living star. Then came the voices. Not words, not even language, but memory itself, layered and ancient, folding into him with a quiet violence that bypassed thought and went straight to the soul. He saw fire first. Not fire like war, but creation. Hands, both human and inhuman, building side by side. Cities etched into cliff faces older than Earth's recorded history. Towers of bone and crystal growing from the red sands of long-lost planets. Syraxa's kind, not as monsters, not as queens or threats, but as scholars, healers, architects of harmony. And beside them humans, Not in uniforms, not with guns, but with open palms and bright, wide eyes. A shared dream. A pact. Then the light turned cold. The betrayal wasn't theatrical. It didn't come with shouting or banners or blood in the streets. It came with silence. A deal signed in back rooms on Earth, inked by hands that feared what they could not patent or weaponize. Technology was stolen. Truths were buried. Syrax's people were labeled myth, dangerous, alien. The bridges were burned before the first shot was even fired. And Darren saw what came next. Entire colonies wiped from the stars. Billions scattered across the void like ash in the dark. Civilizations consumed by war not recorded in any human archive. He screamed, but no sound came. Just that endless pressure of guilt that wasn't his, but had nowhere else to go. Then the core spoke. It didn't use his language. It used something older, something instinctual. Its voice echoed from within him, without sound, without form. Why should your kind be spared? He couldn't lie. The core would feel it, strip it away. It already had. So he didn't. Because I'm still here, he said, not with his voice, but with the whole of who he was. Broken and scared and utterly exposed. I'm trying. Maybe that's enough. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was judgment, measured, felt in the slow thrum of the core's light, which had turned soft, now calmer, steady. He saw faces, not of the dead, but the living. Children, soldiers, strangers, some human, some not, all clinging to a kind of hope that didn't have a name, just a shape, a future. And then, with a brilliance that didn't blind but revealed he was whole again. Back in his body, knees buckled, lungs heaving, heart racing like it was trying to catch up to something far larger than itself. Before him, the core pulsed not wildly, not in warning, but like the slow, deliberate beat of something alive that had just made a decision. Syraxa stood near him, watching, not as a queen, not as an alien, but as someone who had waited a very long time for an answer. He met her eyes. It chose me. She didn't nod, didn't speak. But for the first time since he met her, she looked at him. Not as an anomaly, not as a mistake, but as kin. He felt the shift before it began, the kind that crawled under the skin like a storm on the horizon. Too quiet to be thunder, too thick to ignore. The core's chamber dimmed, its light folding inward like breath held tight in a chest full of dread. The air pressed down. The stillness wasn't peace, it was the pause before violence. Boots clanged against the ancient floor. Sharp, practiced, unafraid. Earth's black-armored soldiers moved in like shadows given form, faces hidden behind gleaming visors. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The fear was in the silence between each footfall. And behind them came Holt. Commander Hadrian Holt. Earth Central's decorated hero, architect of secrets, the man who smiled while lying through his teeth on interstellar broadcasts. He looked at Darren like he was already dead. The kind of gaze that carried a lifetime of manipulation, clean and cold, and surgically precise. You've gone too far, Ryle. His voice echoed, mechanical through his calm-enhanced armor, stripped of empathy. You accessed forbidden systems, consorted with enemy species, violated sovereign directives. As of now, you are relieved of duty. Syraxa moved without sound. Just a breath, just a shift, but it was enough to draw every rifle toward her chest. Her mandibles flared, eyes glinting with ancient rage. She could have torn them all apart. Darren knew it. So did Holt. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, the core reacted. A shimmer of energy rippled through the chamber, washing over walls that weren't walls, just history wrapped in form. The surface of the crystalline structure blossomed like petals unfurling in lightless water, revealing something hidden, a projection. It wasn't data, it was a confession. Holographic images flared Earth leaders in private chambers, signing pacts, destroying records, erasing species from existence. The truth uncoiled itself in front of everyone, raw and inescapable. Earth had known, for centuries, about the Alliance, about Syrax's people, and had chosen the silence of genocide over the risk of unity. Darren turned slowly, eyes locked on Holt. The soldiers began to hesitate. Some lowered their rifles, unsure. You want to start another war, Darren said, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade, just to bury what's already been uncovered? Holt didn't answer. He didn't have to. The lie was too loud to speak over. This ends here, Darren continued. We're not pawns, we're not disposable, and I won't be part of your machine anymore. A pause. Then Siraxa stepped forward. She didn't roar, she didn't strike. She whispered, low and electric. You are more alien than human, she said, and I mean that as a compliment. Something cracked behind Holt's eyes, then not fear, not yet, but recognition. That he'd lost control of the narrative. That truth had slipped from his grasp, and now walked on two legs beside a creature he'd once called enemy. The core pulsed again, not as a weapon, but as a witness. History was being rewritten, not in books, not in orders, but in blood and breath and choice. And Darren had chosen. The walls trembled first deep, guttural, like the ship itself groaned from some ancient memory of war. Then came the sirens. Not mechanical, but organic, pulsing like a warning from something half alive. In the hangar, darkness fractured as hatches burst open and spilled in the froth. They weren't soldiers, they were predators in armor, scarab-like, towering, their limbs jagged like broken blades. The air cracked with plasma. Screams tore through steel and flesh. And in the center of it all, chaos danced like a conductor gone mad. Darren didn't run. He stood where the light from the core still pulsed beneath his skin, its circuitry now etched into the sinew of his arm, glowing faintly like veins of fire running through marble. The fusion wasn't perfect. It hurt, but pain meant power, and power meant choice. He charged into the maelstrom beside Siraxa, who moved like a goddess unchained. Her insectoid warriors poured from the walls, clicking and shrieking, wings flaring as they intercepted the froth in mid-leap. The air was thick with spores, smoke, and dying light. Then came the Froth Prime. Not a beast, a force. Massive, clad in obsidian armor etched with runes that shimmered with anti-light, devouring everything they touched. Its roar was vibration more than sound enough to make ribs ache and thoughts blur. It crashed through Siraxa's elite-like paper, swatting warriors aside. It saw her, locked on. She stepped forward without fear, only resolve. They clashed in a blur of speed and fury, her blade arcing through air charged with gravity distortion. The Prime struck back with a serrated claw that shattered the deck beneath her feet. She dodged once, twice, but on the third strike, he caught her. It wasn't a clean wound, it was cruel, deep, meant to break, not kill. She fell, and something broke in Darren. He didn't scream, didn't hesitate. He ran to her side, caught her before she hit the floor. Her eyes flickered, not with weakness, but with pain she refused to show. He felt her blood, warm and strange, coating his fingers. Then her hand gripped his wrist. Finish it, she whispered, voice frayed but unbroken. He stood, and the core answered. Energy surged through him like fire, and memory fused. The alien tech that had embedded into his arm now bloomed outward tendrils of light, shaping into a weapon unlike any Earth had seen. It wasn't a gun. It wasn't a blade. It was will given form. He turned toward the Froth Prime, who loomed over the battlefield, unaware that its victory had already slipped away. Darren raised his arm, and the weapon pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. It spoke not in commands, but in intent. Shields shattered. Froth warriors faltered. Earth troops rallied behind him, stunned but ready. For once, species fought as one. He shouted, not just to his allies, but to the entire chamber, to anyone still standing, to the stars themselves. If you ever wanted peace, this is the time to bleed for it. The charge was thunder. Time collapsed into raw movement. Darren struck the Prime, his weapon slicing through the impossible armor like light through water. They clashed again and again, flashes of light, impact echoing like mountains falling. And then, the final strike. The core pulsed in sync with Darren's final blow, and the Froth Prime disintegrated into motes of anti-energy, its scream fading into a silence that rang louder than death. Darren collapsed beside Siraxa, smoke curling from his arm, his lungs burning with the weight of choices made. But she was alive, barely, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a soldier, or a human, or even an alien. But as the one who stayed, the bridge groaned beneath his boots, fragments of crystalline lattice breaking off into the swirling abyss below, glowing like fractured stars drowning in a sea of memory. The core nexus pulsed with ancient light, too bright, too alive each heartbeat, not just a thrum of energy, but a whisper of millennia waiting for this exact moment. Syraxa lay slumped against a shattered console, her armor cracked, breath shallow, but eyes fixed on him. Not in weakness, in trust. She didn't ask for salvation. She didn't beg for mercy. She simply watched, as if she already knew what he'd choose, even when he didn't. Above Darren, the core opened like a blooming eye-concentric rings of light, folding back to reveal a throne that wasn't a throne at all. It was a neural interface laced in living filaments, humming with hunger. Power beyond comprehension drifted toward him, wrapping around his mind like a question with teeth. It didn't ask for consent. It offered reward. Take it, it pulsed. Bind flesh to code, rule as they never could, end war, end failure. He stood there, breathing in the frozen air that smelled faintly of burning ozone and alien blood. Images flooded his mind, entire fleets bending to his will, the Croth extinguished in a single silent pulse. Earth's corrupt command exposed and shattered, peace through dominance, stability through annihilation. But his hand never moved. He looked back at Syraxa. Her face, even bruised and bloodied, held more strength than any throne could give. And for a moment, he wasn't a soldier, wasn't a pawn. He was just a man, one who'd seen too much, lost too much, and understood that power doesn't redeem. It only amplifies the broken pieces already inside you. He stepped away from the throne. No more gods, Darren said, voice low but resolute. No more secrets, just choices. The core flickered, uncertain. For the first time in its vast intelligence, it hesitated. Darren lifted his hand not to command, but to ask. And the core listened. Instead of unleashing death, he rewrote the directive. The energy surged through the nexus, not as fire but as light. Across the moon, across the battlefield, across both fleets in orbit, every weapon powered down. Engines went dark. Targeting systems blinked out. Missiles, once humming with vengeance, now inert as dust. A wave of silence swept the stars. Ceasefire. Not through force. Through a man who said no to the machine. The core dimmed, its light receding into calm neutrality. Darren slumped to his knees, trembling not from pain, but from the weight lifted. He had chosen to end a war without becoming another tyrant. And for the first time since Europa's ice cracked open, he felt human again. Behind him, Syraxa stirred, her voice like a rasp of thunder barely forming words. You chose restraint. Darren turned, smiling through exhaustion. I chose hope. The ice cracked softly beneath their feet as the first blush of Europa's sun shimmered across the distant horizon, light catching on fractured glaciers and the metal hull of a ship reborn. The battle was over. The war perhaps paused, but in the stillness something else had begun. Something fragile, something possible. Syraxa stood at the foot of her vessel, cloaked once again in the regal shimmer of her command, though her posture no longer screamed domination. It spoke of mourning, of choices made under dying moons, of blood spilled in ancient names now whispering into silence. A faint gash remained across her side, healed with nanite silk, but the wound Darren had wrapped was untouched beneath it, as if left on purpose. A human's touch in a place of alien design. He approached, boots crunching quietly through the crystalline crust. No more weapons, no orders, just a man worn, changed, and still not sure what he had become. She watched him with eyes deeper than memory, the sharp mandibles of her lower face relaxing, shifting back, revealing the elegance of what once was called monstrous. Her fingers elongated, jointed in ways human anatomy couldn't replicate, reached out, hesitant, then confident. She didn't shake his hand. She rested her palm over his, pressing her life against his pulse, forehead inclining just slightly. An old gesture, older than language. Perhaps a goodbye, perhaps a promise. Perhaps, she said quietly, voice softened into something closer to breath. Your kind still remembers how to be brave. Darren smiled. Not the cocky grin he once wore on Earth, back when things were simpler and survival meant sarcasm. This was something gentler, something earned. And maybe your kind, he said, remembers how to hope. Behind them, Earth's command channel sputtered to life in his ear, full of scrambling politicians and panicked admirals. The Corps' memory leak had gone system-wide proof of the cover-up, the ancient alliance, the broken oath humanity once made and then buried. They couldn't deny it anymore. The broadcast had already reached Earth, Mars, Titan colonies, the Kuiper Line. Peace talks were no longer a dream, they were inevitable. Because the people had seen, and more importantly, they had chosen to believe. Syraxa stepped back, ascending the smooth incline into the vessel's heart. The walls pulsed around her as if welcoming her home not as a queen, but as someone who had changed, someone who had let a stranger bind her wound in the dark, someone who no longer saw humans as just descendants of betrayal. Darren watched as the ship lifted into the thin atmosphere, wings of liquid metal unfolding like a phoenix from ancient snow. The sky above cracked with light, not fire, not war, just dawn. His voice returned, not in words, but in narration. A truth he now understood. The greatest victories aren't won by guns or power, but by those brave enough to stand between two sides and say, not this time. Europa grew quiet behind him. Earth grew louder ahead. But in his chest, something steady remained, not silence. So in the end, it wasn't the weapons, or the armies, or the empires that shaped the future. It was a soldier lost in ice, a queen once born for war, and a forgotten pact whispered back into the stars by the Corps' final light. Darren didn't save the galaxy by fighting harder. He saved it by listening, by choosing mercy when power was in reach. In Syraxa, she remembered something even older than vengeance: trust. Now the peace they sparked trembles like a match in the dark, surrounded by secrets still waiting to burn. But the first step was taken. And sometimes, that's all it takes to rewrite fate. Because if one human and one alien could stop a war, what else have they just begun? Don't look away. The truth is never over. And neither is this story. Subscribe to Alien Chronicles because next time, the stars won't wait.